Our lesson continues in Chapter 11, Section 2.2, King John and the Magna Carta, pages 308 to 309. Go ahead, log into Loda.usd website, and from there, Clever, and from Clever, Cengage Learning. And of course, Cengage Learning, you will need to enter your student email and password so that it will lead you to our National Geographic Learning, which is our world history book, Unit 5, and from Unit 5, Chapter 11, Section 2.2, that is pages 308 to 309, King John and the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. The chapter's essential question is, how did Europe change during the Middle Ages? And the objective of this lesson is to explain how the Magna Carta marked the first step toward democratic government in Western Europe, which eventually influenced the rest of the world. The Magna Carta was a major step toward democratic government in Western Europe. Here in Lesson 2.2, we will explore the causes and effects of this important piece of document. This presentation from the British Library provides an excellent explanation with animation about the historical development of the Great Charter or the Magna Carta.
This may look like a plain, unassuming piece of parchment, but is actually one of the most famous documents in the world. Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter, has inspired people across the centuries, from Thomas Jefferson to Mahatma Gandhi. But why was the Charter originally created, and what does it actually say? Let us take you back to medieval England. It's the year 1215, and the ruler is King John. Many people believe that King John was one of the worst kings in history. He imprisoned his former wife, he starved his opponents to death, he allegedly murdered his own nephew, and pulled the beards of the Irish chiefs. King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London, and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the king's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. Although most of the Charter's clauses dealt with medieval rights and customs, Magna Carta has become a powerful symbol of liberty around the world. The most famous clause, which is still part of the law today, for the first time gave all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one will we sell. However, this clause was not as liberal as it sounds. The Charter only applied to free men. The vast majority of people in 1215 were unfree peasants who were ruled over by their landowners. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the Pope declared the Charter invalid. When King John died of dysentery in 1216, 9-year-old Henry III took to the throne. To keep the peace, Magna Carta was reissued several times during the 13th century, until it was finally made part of English law. Magna Carta has lived on for 800 years and is echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps Magna Carta's most important legacy is that everyone, including our leaders, must obey the law. What started out as a document of specific complaints from a group of barons has turned into an international symbol of liberty, without which we might not have the rights we value so much today.
From lesson 2.1, we learned that the king were regaining power. So King John is just one of the many kings who came from a long line of powerful English kings that began in 1066. During the Middle Ages, kings are very wealthy and powerful, like King John. However, kings like him wants more. Their power and position eventually weakened by waging series of failed wars, and wars are very expensive. Wars are very expensive, and in order for kings to fund their warfares, they need to tax their subjects. And of course, this made the subjects of King John to be very unhappy. What happened was a group of local barons took advantage of John's deceased power to stage a rebellion. The barons believed that by raising their taxes, the king had violated common law. And this common law exists to make sure that everyone is treated equally. And when we say everyone, these are the nobility or the noble class only. So in 1215, the barons forced King John to place his seal on their document, which came to be known as Magna Carta or the Great Charter. It was meant to just be a contract between the king and his nobles. However, Magna Carta made the king subject to the law of the land and limited his authority. Now, this simple piece of paper is recognized as the foundation of English law, a further step toward democracy in the form of representative government that took place in 1258. As was explained with the presentation a while ago, this led to the development of the parliament, which is a group of representatives from different counties, which is most likely is represented by noble class only. So by 1272, there is a further development. After King Henry died, the son of King John, his son, King Edward, rose to the throne. By 1295, Edward assembled what is considered to be the first truly representative parliament. This group of representatives include 2 knights from every county and 2 residents from each town. They passed laws, imposed taxes, and discussed political and judicial matters. From that point on, English kings would have to share their power to these representatives whether they like it or not. So this is a big improvement or development from the sole authority of the king to the different representatives, whether, most likely it is just represented by the elites or the nobility or the noble class, but it is a major step towards democracy which was developed eventually. Specifically, representative democracy, because prior to this, you have to understand that the Greeks and the Romans exercised some sort of democracy even prior to this development. This development is very important not just because ordinary people eventually had a voice in the government, but it also protected the rights of individuals to this what we call due process of law. Now let's take a look at how the Magna Carta affected the lives of ordinary people around the world.
This is the story of an 800-year-old medieval document known as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It's one of the most famous documents in the world. But how did this old piece of parchment become such a powerful symbol of our rights and freedoms? Magna Carta was granted in 1215 and established for the first time that everyone, even the king, had to obey the law. When Magna Carta was printed for the first time, it became the first law that all English lawyers studied. But many people didn't realize its significance. Shakespeare wrote a play about King John in which he failed to mention Magna Carta. In the 1600s, English lawyers used Magna Carta to challenge King Charles I. At this time, the king could ignore Parliament and imprison anyone who opposed him. Inspired by Magna Carta, Sir Edward Coke wrote the Petition of Right, which set out to limit the king's powers. Around the same time, Magna Carta was taken overseas to America by the first British settlers. Many American colonies based their own laws on Magna Carta. Then, in the 1770s, the Americans fought for independence from Britain. Magna Carta became a symbol of American liberty, and its principles were echoed in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. In 18th century Britain, Magna Carta was used to protest against the censorship of the press. At this time, people could be imprisoned without trial for criticizing the king. When newspaper publisher John Wilkes was arrested for insulting King George III, he used Magna Carta to fight for his freedom. He claimed that ancient English liberties were under threat. Wilkes's campaign showed Magna Carta on everything from posters to teapots. You could say that Magna Carta went viral. In the 1800s, very few people had the right to vote in Britain. A nationwide movement of working people known as the Chartists, inspired by Magna Carta, created a people's charter to fight for all men to have the vote. Then, in the early 1900s, the suffragettes used Magna Carta to argue that all women should have the right to vote too. Increasingly, people across the empire argued for rights equal to those of British citizens. Gandhi fought successfully for greater freedom of Indian settlers in South Africa. He described the resulting document as the Magna Carta of our liberty in this land. In his famous speech from the dock, Nelson Mandela declared his admiration for Magna Carta and for Western democracy, which he contrasted with the oppressive South African regime. Perhaps the most significant influence of Magna Carta today is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Written after the atrocities of World War II, the Declaration states that people around the world are protected by fundamental human rights, regardless of their citizenship, race, gender, or beliefs. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said that the Declaration may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. Although very few of Magna Carta's original clauses remain valid in English law, it continues to inspire people worldwide. Not a bad legacy for an 800-year-old document.
Now let's go to the review and assess questions. For number 1, reading check. In what way did Magna Carta limit the king's authority? And for number 2, analyze the cause and effect. How did the establishment of the Parliament change the government of England? And for number 3, make inferences. Do you think that Magna Carta affected the lives of ordinary people? Why or why not? Now go to your Google Classroom and go ahead, open Review and Assess Chapter 11, Section 2, Lesson 2. And go ahead, fill up the information, last name, first name, class period and date, and the key vocabs in the right side of on the right side of the slide inside the box. And don't forget to write the title and obviously the answers to the review and assess questions.